Well, it's being domesticated. Companies that are suddenly seizing upon this are trying to give us these different flavors of domesticated AI.
I was waking up this morning, waking up before it's getting 9.
And I believe we're on the transition into the fourth epoch to be programmed by humans. They can control their own programs.
はい、こんにちは。ピボットの竹下です。今日はですね、世界的な科学史家、科学の歴史に詳しい歴史家の、ジョージ・ダイソンさんに話を聞きます。ダイソンさん2つの顔を持ってます。一つは、自然派の顔ですね。アラスカ先住民のカヤック、そういったことを作っていたりとか、あとかつて地上30メートルの、木の家に住んでいたこともあると。それで変わった方なんですけど、もう一つの面としてですね、お父さんが有名な世界的な物理学者のフリーマン・ダイソンさんです。なのでチューリングとかノイマンとか本当に現代コンピューターの初期の歴史に詳しくて、このチューリングの大聖堂っていう本も過去に書いています。そんな彼がですね、最近このアナロジアという本を書いてまして、かなり変わった面白い本です。で、何を言ってるかというと、この AI 全盛の時代の次の時代にアナログの時代が来るって言ってるんですよね。でもアナログというとみんなと思うかもしれませんけど、決してそれはこの iPhone とか全部捨てて自然に戻るという意味ではなくて、アナログというのは非常に複雑で非常にノイズがあって、いろんなことが、まるで自然の中にいるような混乱した世界がやってくると。でそれはすごくいいことなんだっていうことを言っています。例えば AI なんかも今は飼いならされた AI ばかりですけど、そのうち野生の AI、ワイルド AI まで登場するという話をするんですね。非常に刺激的なインタビューになると思いますので、早速ジョージ本人とつないで話を聞いてみたいと思います。So hi, George Dyson. Welcome to Pivot. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me here.
So I have my your book, the latest Japanese version of your book, Analogia. It says the next big thing after AI. So let me start with asking you about, are you excited about the Japanese translation being out?
Yes, I haven't seen it yet, but
yeah, it's a beautiful cover. Yes.
Yeah, my experience is always the design and the translations are very good. I think in some cases probably better. That book, The Start and the Canoe, was so much more popular in Japan than in America. I think probably because it was very well translated.
Have you been to Japan?
Yes, twice. Both times were extraordinary experiences. The first was 1992, when it looked like Japan would get the Northern Islands back from Russia. And that, because that would have been a tremendous event, and somewhere high up in the Japanese levels was decided that the way to celebrate the transfer of the islands would be to send a Japanese kayak expedition to the Northern Islands to demonstrate to the world how close they are. And my job would have been to build the kayaks, and unfortunately it didn't happen.
And the next time you came how was it?
Next time, completely different. Year 2000, invited by Suntory for a whiskey commercial. Also done with extraordinary craftsmanship and beautiful production and a whole lot of fun.
Great. So I'm going to start the conversation by asking you about analog, because in your great book, it seems to me that you argue that we came from analog to digital, but we're going back to analog, which kind of maybe puzzles our viewers. Could you elaborate on that, what it means to, what analog is? Yes.
Yes, I think first of all that's a little bit misrepresented. We're not so much going back to analog, but we're going forward to a new level. Sort of an analog layer is growing on top of our digital layer. If you say back to analog, people think, well, we're just going to read books and listen to.
That's right.
When the digital revolution happened after World War II, we had an immense surplus of analog electronics, and a few very oddball, clever people figured out how to build digital computers using that analog hardware. And I think the same thing is happening today. We have this extraordinary surplus of digital equipment that most of the time is just sort of wasting its cycles. And nature has a way of using things that are wasted. And in nature, of course, most of the computation is analog computation. And I believe that's coming back. It's coming back from the sort of top down with large sort of internet networks and operations like Facebook would be an example, that where really the complexity is in the architecture and the topology of the network, not in the digital code itself. Just like if you take a brain or a nervous system apart, you won't find any digital logical code. You just have the structure of the network is where the information and the complexity is.
So in your book, you define analog as like continuous functions as opposed to digital, which is discrete. So to me, it seems that analog kind of embrace like failure and all the other noises. Is that what your definition means?
Yes, analog is much more robust in the sense that in a purely digital system, if one bit is out of place, the whole thing can fail. Of course, we're building software that very much self-corrects and has learned to sort of live with that. Yet still, in nature, analog systems are much better for control systems that don't have any sort of single point of failure.
Also, in your book, I like your example about like measuring the road. You can use like a digital technology to just measure the middle of the road using like a computer, but also you can like use a simple string like this, and you can like fold it, and you can see the middle. So this is like an example of analog computing and digital computing.
Right, and you get a arbitrarily accurate answer with the string. It's it's more technically, in theory, it's more accurate than you could ever digital compute it. Yeah. You can do the same if you have a piece of wood and you want to find the middle, if you just hold it across two fingers and move your fingers together.
Like this?
They will end in the middle because the side that's heavier sticks on that. And so it's a very, quick analog way of finding the middle of a stick. So there's lots of, and of course, nature uses those tricks all the time, and that's what we're doing in our brains. I mean, our brains are computing with maps, not with code. And that's what's fascinating about sort of ChatGPT, because we're suddenly starting to do the same thing in computers. I mean, we've made a map of the language, and we're sort of gaining information from using those maps in a very, very different way than the strictly logical way.
Interesting. One of the things I love about your book is that every example you gave, you have to stop reading and think about it for a while. And I really love the string analogy because I used to think that humans are bad at calculating or measuring something, and we should use like digital technology. But you can just use like a simple thing as a string and measure a road. So we're forgetting about that technology. So what's your take on that? Why did you illustrate such a example in your book?
Well, everybody complained. I mean, when I first started talking about this analog stuff, people would say, I don't understand. Explain it. How to give us a very simple example of something that you can compute by analog means or you can compute by digital means. So it's that middle of the road is very simple, because you either have a digital, a tape measure or that's marked off in some kind of units, and you count how many units, and then you divide that number by 2 and you get the middle. But with a string, you don't use any numbers. It's a continuous function. You just find the middle.
And also, could you explain the 4 epochs of nature? We started from hand tools and moved on to, and we are in the maybe 3rd step right now.
Yes, yeah. This is just my simplification. It's always, in geology or something, where we divide things into layers, but they're not really discrete layers. So in my view, the first layer of sort of technological evolution is the era of hand tools, where we had, we used our tools with our hands, and that was the sort of limit of what we could control. The second epoch is what happened with our industrial revolution, where we started to use machines to build other machines, and then use those machines to control nature. And the third epoch, the epoch that we are in, sort of since the the digital revolution is the era of self-reproducing codes, where we invented code software that reproduces itself and itself starts controlling the machines. And I believe we're on the transition into the fourth epoch, which is machines that no longer need to be programmed by humans. They can control their own programs, and of course, analog machines fall into that regime because they don't. We tend to assume that, because we grew up with computers that are programmed, we believe that computers have to have programmers in order to operate, and that's not necessarily true.
How about ChatGPT? Which epoch is ChatGPT on?
Yeah, ChatGPT. I mean, for me, this is just a wonderful thing. It's like suddenly having a grandchild who is 3 years old and is interesting. I mean, because I've been sort of imagining and dreaming about these things for a long time. I mean, even my earliest book about technology, Darwin Among the Machines, it ends with this legend from the 14th century, or actually the 13th century, that this myth of trying to build a speaking machine, and the scientists work until they're so tired they fall asleep, and nothing they do works. And then finally, when they finally fall asleep, the machine wakes up and speaks. And we're sort of in that moment now, where suddenly we've been trying to get computers to sort of speak reasonably well in our languages, and suddenly that breakthrough has happened, and everybody's quite amazed.
Yeah, so George, I'm also excited, but on the other hand, I'm kind of afraid, because there will be some technology or even robots we can't control. Is not that a nightmare, or are you positive about that?
No, I have very mixed feelings. The sort of short answer is that I'm not at all afraid of bad AI, the sort of classic bad AI, the Terminator that tries to take over the world. I mean, we'll figure out how to stop that. I'm much more afraid of good AI, which is what's happening now. That the AI that is marketed as, just take this, like domestic pet, sort of take this animal into your house, and it will be very well behaved, and that to me is a little more scary. The important thing about ChatGPT, and what really has, people are very intuitive and sensitive, and we've been, for 50 years, sort of the definition of a digital computer is that it's a machine that if you ask the same question twice or 3 times or 4 times, you will always get the same answer. That's what digital computers do. And then suddenly ChatGPT has given us a machine where you can ask the same question 5 minutes later and get a quite different answer. And people realize, oh, that's something very new and profound and different.
Do you think von Neumann and Turing had imagined this kind of future?
Yes, and both of them were, unfortunately died very young. But even at the ends of their short lives, they were completely preoccupied with sort of non-digital computing. They knew that would be the more interesting thing, and I think would have been quite surprised that for almost 75 years we've been stuck with the same method of computing that was developed right at the end of World War II. We haven't really moved into anything different.
Let me clarify. What do you mean by non-digital computers? Because
for instance, analog computers, or, von Neumann only took out 2 patents in his life, even though he's claimed to have been such a great inventor. But one of the patents is the secret patent for a nuclear weapon. And where actually the co-author of his partner in the patent was Klaus Fuchs, who turned out to be a Russian spy. And the other patent is for a method of non-von Neumann computing, as I answered the first question, sort of with a topological network rather than a sequential digital code. That's the big difference between analog and digital computing. That in digital computing, everything happens one thing happens at a time, step by step. Even though we have billions of steps per second, it seems continuous, but it's step by step. Whereas in an analog computer, sort of everything happens at once, and that's very different.
How about quantum computers?
That I stay away from. I mean, I leave quantum computing to other people. There's many experts in that. I don't really, I watch it from the sidelines, but I think it's also at this very early stage. It's at the stage that digital computing was in the 1930s probably, and I think we're going to see some real breakthroughs. But personally, I think analog, sort of non-quantum, very simple analog chips are going to change our lives more than quantum computing will. But that's my bet, and I may be wrong.
Let's go back to you used the interesting term good AI and bad AI. So do you think AI right now is like kind of too commercialized? We're trying to take too much control of AI right now at the moment.
Well, it's being domesticated. I mean, we're treating AI as if saying that all the animals in the world the only animals in the world are cats, chickens, and dogs, ignoring all the other animals. So these companies that are suddenly seizing upon this are trying to give us these different flavors of domesticated AI, sort of like different, would you like to have a Chihuahua or would you like to have a Great Dane? But they're all dogs. And I'm personally much more interested on what happens with AI in the wild that's not domesticated.
Oh, wild AI, that's an interesting phrase. What do you mean by AI in the wild?
Well, AI that completely evolves on its own, just the same way I spent most of my life in the wilderness. I don't like. I mean, I enjoy being in cities, but personally, I would rather live in sort of closer to the wild. And I think that the same with AI. Things are just, the animals in the wild are much more interesting than the animals in a pet store or, in a zoo. Of course, we try and capture wild animals and present them in our own environment. That's sort of middle ground.
Yeah, I 100% agree because I like to spend myself in the wilderness, so I know what you mean. Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a national park or something. I mean, you can have an empty block in the middle of a city and suddenly weeds start to grow, but nobody plants them. They grow on their own.
So going back to the fourth epoch, do you think in the fourth epoch we'll have a bunch of wild AIs like running around? I don't know if it's running around, but bunch of wild AIs around us?
That's what I imagine will happen.
That's interesting.
Sort of the way nature works, that these things, I mean, by definition, a real AI is something we cannot control. I mean, that's if we can control it, then it's sort of predictable. And Jack Good, who was Turing's partner during World War II, breaking the German codes, who sort of closer to Turing than anybody who lived for a long time afterwards. And his definition of a super intelligent machine, it was a machine that believes people cannot think. The same way we argue about whether machines can think, and a real AI will, argue about whether we can think.
So, but when we look at history, human beings tend to take control of nature. That's what we did so far, or maybe do not respect, Native Americans or indigenous people, but we try to take control of that. So I'm worried that the same thing will happen if there's a lot of wild AI. We try to make it into a domestic AI. Do you think that's the case?
It's possible. Of course, I'm on the other side. I believe, and that's not that if I wish something will happen, that's not that I believe that's what will happen, but that's what I hope will happen. And so what I think will happen is that this sort of is nature's way of not getting revenge, but just showing us that nature is much bigger than we are. And the odd thing is that it sort of takes us back to the world in which we as a human species evolved. I mean, we spent most of the human history living with, in worlds populated with spirits who we didn't understand and in no way thought we could control. And we're actually quite comfortable with that. And if we go back to that in a way, I don't think it necessarily will be a bad thing for people.
I wish we can live in such a world, but it's kind of human nature to wanting to control something. So do you think we need to change our mindset?
We may. I mean, it's some of the people speaking up suddenly who are in the AI business saying, "Hey, wait a minute, this is moving a little too fast." So there's a certain recognition of of that, and we'll have to, we sort of have to grow up in a different way. And it really is like, which is one reason I put all that stuff in my book, about the sort of first contact between the people who had lived in the Aleutian Islands for 10,000 years, but had no written language. And then one day, the Russians show up who have a written language, and both sides have to adjust to the way the other side works.
It was interesting. You mentioned that the Russians tried to adapt to the indigenous people instead of just vanishing it out. Do you see that's one of the ways we can be harmonious to new technologies or new nature? Do you think that's the way we should take?
Yes, I think in a way we should. And of course, the Russians are in getting a very bad reputation right now. But at the time they came to Alaska, they did something which is quite unusual in sort of colonial history, was that they adopted the native technology rather than just eliminating it. And they were very resourceful, and that's in a way how we, dealing with real AI, not some of the stuff we have now, but we're going to have to do the same thing. I mean, it will be like meeting a different culture that operates very differently than we do, and there's going to have to be adjustment on both sides.
Right. I think that's the part we can learn lessons from the past, because in your book, was shocking for me that in the 19th century, the U.S. government, in order to track down the last Apaches, they used the first large-scale high-speed optical telecommunications, which kind of they borrowed from the Apaches. So they used technologies to take control of people. So I think, what kind of lessons we can learn from that episode?
Yes, and they gave every individual Apache a number.
Yes, like an ID tag, right?
Exactly the way it works today. I mean, you really are, effectively now we are pretty much governed by our unique identity number now is our cell phone number. That's sort of the ultimate identity of who we are in the digital world, and we're doing the same thing is happening now. The lesson to draw from that, I'm not exactly sure, other than to remember that it happened before.
So there were two generals who adopted the ID tag and who adopted the high-speed optical telecommunications. Can you elaborate on that? Are there any difference between the two?
Yeah, there was General Crook and General Miles, and they had a very different approach. Crook really admired the Apaches. I mean, he knew his job was to sort of bring them to subjugate them, but he did it with a certain, I think, sensibility. I mean, he always rode a mule, and he learned that you had to act like an Apache if you were going to have any success. Whereas General Miles was the absolute opposite. I mean, he traveled around with a brass band, and it was by modern standards a completely genocidal criminal, and it's a very dark, sad part of American history that I think people need to be reminded of. That this, all the wonderful things that the digital world has brought us, didn't bring that to everybody.
So why do human beings try to sweep away all those unwritten, rich knowledge?
I don't know. It baffles me. I mean, if you notice that in this book, Analogia, there are 4 young characters. There's Lawrence Waxel, who's 11 years old and gets to go on the expedition to America with the Russians. His dad is the captain and just brings his 11-year-old kid along. And so his story, going to meet the Americans in America for the first time. There's another white boy who's captured by the Apaches, also at age 11. And then when the U.S. Army captures his people, he doesn't want to go back to his parents. He wants to stay with the Apaches. And then there was another 13-year-old who came to meet with Geronimo to sort of make the peace treaty. So these young boys who, of course, I put in the book because I identify with them. I mean, when I was that age, that's what I would have loved to do: go off and live in the, in the wild with the native people. And I think that's a very strong that's a lesson to us that we don't have progress doesn't always have to be forward towards more technology. It's of course you give people, if people become very wealthy, what do they want to do? They want to go out and go camping and leave all their stuff behind.
Yeah, because your book was very exciting. I read it twice, and it was like an adventure for me. And it came to me that maybe we are like improving in the technology side, but before iPhones and iPads and all the other things, there were more. It was kind of high tech in a sense. You were using nature as technology, and people are very smart. Do you see that way?
Yes, people are extremely smart. It's just frightening how smart, and people are, particularly smart when they're not wasting their time, doing all the stuff we do today. I mean, it's I think that's the real danger, of course, of technology and artificial intelligence, is not that the machines are becoming more intelligent. Clearly, they obviously are, but the danger is that we become less intelligent. Just by using Google Maps, we've completely. I've lost my. I don't carry a paper map in my car anymore. We lose those. Huge part of the human brain used to be local knowledge about where things were. I don't know how it is in Tokyo, but it used to be people had to know their way around London completely in their head, and that knowledge just disappears, or navigating in the ocean, that kind of thing. So hopefully we replace it with something else, but it also can go away if you don't exercise it.
Is that because the digital world is too much simplifying the world in like 1 to zeros? Is that the case?
Yes, a lot of it is just scale, that we see so much of the world now through a 3 by 5 inch screen, and the human vision system is built to be aware of the bird that's almost behind you, and if you don't practice that, you do lose it. It's a scary thing, and I think that's but then people have always been afraid of things that haven't turned out as bad as they're afraid of. So,
but in your book, you kind of took like a positive view that we're going to that like fourth epoch, which is more wild, more noise, more errors. So why would that happen instead of we going to much more digital world, but we're going to the great analog world? Why is that?
I think in the end, those systems will win. The sort of all the civilizations have tried to sort of build perfect bureaucracies. They've tended to fail. Now, the danger is now, of course, we could have a perfect bureaucracy that absolutely gives everybody a number and controls everything. But my hope is that these civilizations, or the cultures that allow more sort of unexpected creativity and stuff, will in the end, be stronger and win out. But that really is the sort of argument of our age as to which way we're going to go.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I totally agree, because when you look at nation states, if a state tries to control everything, control the market, control people, it collapses in the end, and people like freedom, more wildness. So it's the digital world is too kind of bureaucratic right now.
Yeah, it's always, I mean, the Soviet 5-year plans just never worked out. I mean, it sort of by definition you're guaranteed in 5 years to be in the wrong place if you when you're kayaking. One of the dangerous things that can happen is that you, in a tidal rapids, you'll run into a whirlpool. The rule is just steer exactly towards the whirlpool, because by the time you get there, the whirlpool will have moved somewhere else. Whereas if you try and avoid it, it may, then you may run into it. It's the same with plans. That the plans will sort of guarantee, that you're going to be in the wrong place.
So, like the things like how you survive a whirlpool, is that written in some documents, or you just learn from the others?
No, you learn that, or somebody tells you. It's true of car accidents too. I think. I mean, if you're on the highway and ahead of you 2 cars collide, the safest course to take is right towards the point of the accident, because it's it's going to be moving somewhere else.
By the way, how do you go to the bathroom when you're in a kayak? It's a random question.
That's a very interesting question. And the interesting thing is that it actually has been answered, but there's in the published literature, it's always seen as a mystery. How did the Aleuts urinate on these long voyages? And there actually is a very simple answer, and I heard it from directly from someone who knew, but I think it's probably better to keep it a mystery.
Yeah, I ask this question because a lot of things we really want to know are not documented. So yeah, I think that's the point of being too much digital, is that we're not aware of the real things we want to know. So one of the favorite parts of my book is about the voices of the dolphins. And yeah, I love this part. Could you elaborate for our audience? You study a lot of killer whales, how they're different, how they're similar to human beings.
Yes, this story really comes from my personal experience. First of all, because when I was a young, 11 years old, a woman named Trudy Szilard befriended me and was very influential. She was the widow of Leo Szilard, who actually invented fission. So one of the great atomic physicists. And because I was the son of an atomic great physicist, everybody always say, "Oh, you must be going to be a scientist and go into physics." And she took me aside and said, you don't have to be a scientist. You can be whatever you want, and don't listen to anybody else. And she gave me this book called The Voice of the Dolphins that her husband Leo had written as a science fiction story to tell the world. So it's a story where the dolphins, the humans are going to destroy themselves with nuclear weapons, and the dolphins step in, who turn out to be intelligent and kind of take over the world to keep us safe from the humans. Then a few years later, as a young teenager, I ended up in Canada, living on an island where with another great sort of mentor of mine, Dr. Paul Spong, who was studying killer whales. So this was more than 50 years ago. And he started listening to them with underwater microphones and tape recording everything that was all the communication between the killer whales. And everyone believed that it would only take a few years, we would decipher the language of the dolphins. And it's 50 years later. Now we have all the computing power in the world. We have way, way, way better underwater recordings of thousands and thousands of conversations. And nobody has even begun to decipher language of the killer whales. And they think, oh, well, here we can tell dialects, or maybe they're talking about hunting. But personally, I don't believe languages needs to be there, because they see the world through sound. So it's as if we could communicate with light directly. If I could send images directly to your brain, we wouldn't have needed language. We wouldn't need to sort of devolve down to these strings of symbolic code where I say cat, and you then in your mind you reconstruct a picture of a cat. I just would send you a picture of a cat. And I firmly believe that killer whales and the other cetaceans and dolphins have a similar form of communication that is not a symbolic language the way we expect it. And it's the same problem with aliens. People, listening for alien communications are always looking for words. They expect, the aliens to speak. It won't be English, but it'll be a language, and it may not be language at all.
Do you think that dolphins and killer whales are much more intelligent than human beings?
I'm not sure if they're much more intelligent, but they certainly are. If you spend time with them, you just become sort of emotionally convinced that they are very intelligent. Whether they're more intelligent, I think they're intelligent in a very different way, and they live in these communicating groups that are communicating all the time. It's as if, again, because they can communicate for miles in the water. Sound in water behaves very differently than sound in air. So it's as if we sort of we're in like the perfect restaurant where you're having a dinner conversation. You can hear everybody at the table.
So do you mean that dolphins are more like kind of analog? Is that?
Well, it's I think their communication may be non-verbal. And that's, in some way, in a technical way, that's what analog means. It means not logical, not verbal. And I think that's what we should look for. And that's sort of my, not prediction, but just imagined thing is that, it could be some analog computer system actually is able to speak to the killer whales in a way that we aren't, that we may not get there with digital computers. We think we're going to turn the AI into our servants and robots and pets, getting well paid now or taking care of the machines.
I was waking up this morning, waking up before it's getting night.
When I think about the atomic bomb, and you kind of wrote a chapter about it, and especially for Japanese, it's a very shocking.
That's very hard to do, and the people who created the atomic bomb.
So my favorite book in those days was a fellow named Mainu.
著者の思いや日本語にまだ翻訳されていない生のグローバル情報をお届けします。
Japanese work culture in the companies where people are stuck.
I believe the only logical approach.
Any advice for Japanese investors?
So I cannot say too many times, stay with what you know, and that's how you'll be successful. Everybody knows something about something. Stay with it. Now, some people will say, oh, Jim, that's boring. Ryan, be boring. If you want to be a successful investor, be boring.